I'm done with the Odyssey, and we're now venturing into new waters. Instead of doing something really in-depth right away, I'm going to take a few days, maybe a week, and introduce you to a writer you probably haven't heard of. But you're going to really enjoy this because this guy is a character, and he's a humorist, and he's a satirist. And what is he satirizing? Well, he's basically satirizing Soviet socialism. And even though Soviet socialism, which is, of course, collapsed with the Berlin Wall and glasnost and perestroika and the Communist Party abolishing itself, it might seem like that has now all receded into history. But there are some weird and almost very telling parallels between what this writer writes about in Soviet society, writing in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and things that we experience, in a sense, as socialism begins to raise its ugly head here in America and in Western society. So have you heard of this guy, Mikhail Zoshchenko? No, you probably haven't. Of course, if you follow Russian literature at all, there is an incredibly distinguished line of great Russian writers going all the way back, of course, to the 19th century. People like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And then coming into the 20th century, of course, there's Maxim Gorky and Pasternak, who wrote Dr. Zhivago, and then on through figures like Solzhenitsyn and others. Zoshchenko is not in that company. Would not be seen as a, quote, great writer. And it's partly because, unlike Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, he doesn't actually take on great themes, war and peace, crime and punishment. No, this guy, as we will see, is nothing more than a kind of wry, clever, and sly observer of Soviet socialism in action. The left doesn't like him. Why? Because he made the Russian people laugh at their own society, laugh at socialism, laugh at the kind of comic and ridiculous attempt to remake society and remake human nature. And Zoshchenko doesn't bother to argue with any of it. In fact, he operates through fiction. He creates characters. And he just shows you these characters who are essentially, well, they're versions of himself. I don't think it's fair to say that it's Zoshchenko himself, but it's parts of himself in these situations, kind of noticing and participating in the comic absurdity of it all. A little bit of background on this dude. Mikhail Zoshchenko, born in 1895, grew up in St. Petersburg in the period before the Russian Revolution. Started off as a writer, and people began to notice he was sort of a detached observer. He would notice things. He doesn't try to be too moralistic. He looks at manners instead of morals. So his subject is, let's call it mores. Mores are the customs and the behaviors of people. And he doesn't go to the fantastic the way Gogol did, or he doesn't try to probe deep into the psychology in the way that, say, Dostoevsky does. He's a strange fellow. Was a little frail, apparently, sensitive, detached. And when the communists took over in Russia, Lenin, Zoshchenko joined a group of writers who were, well, they were called fellow travelers. And of course, we use the term fellow traveler today to mean someone who's kind of running alongside socialism. The reason that these writers did that is they didn't want to get into trouble. They basically said, all right, well, you know what, we're sort of on board with this socialism. We're not trying to bring the Tsarist regime back. We're not counter-revolutionaries. There's no reason to arrest us. But we're going to, because we're on your side, we're going to claim a certain independence of outlook. Russia has always valued its writers, so kind of leave us alone and let us do our thing. Our business is literature and not government. So my point is that fellow traveling here is a ruse. And Zoshchenko and others are claiming to be fellow travelers so they can actually do their work in peace. Zoshchenko is not funny in the obvious sense that he's telling jokes. He creates very funny situations, and it's funniest to the people who live under those situations because they see right away that this guy is like on target. But even if you don't live in those situations, as long as you have some familiarity with the sort of bureaucratic heavy-handedness of socialism, you can see that this guy is, as they say, circling right over the target. He managed to stay for most of his life outside the reach of Russian authorities. He dealt with the ordinary life of Russian citizens. So his characters tend to be, this guy's a town official, that guy's a clerk, this guy, a peasant. And but very often it's the ordinary citizen, but dealing with some aspect of socialism, like the Soviet hospital or the Soviet literacy program. And as we'll see, these stories are very enjoyable for the way that this guy treats them. He uses a kind of homespun language, and there's a contrast between the bureaucratic prose of the Russian sort of commissariat, socialist language, if you will, which is highly technical, bombastic, and the proletariat. And what he does is he has a contrast between that, quote, official language and the language that ordinary people speak. So he will have like little chuckles and snorts and guffaws all written into the speech itself. And so I think the next few days with Zoshchenko are going to be really fun. Toward the end of his life, he was actually called out, along with another very prominent dissident, a woman named Anna Akhmatova, a poet. And the Soviet authorities were like, Anna Akhmatova and Zoshchenko are troublemakers. And Zoshchenko basically realized that the last part of his life, he might have to cool it. And so he did. He sort of went silent. He didn't really write anymore. But we have his body of work. And what I have with me, not easy to get, by the way, is his book is called Scenes from a Bathhouse. Now, he doesn't mean a bathhouse in the gay sense, but he means scenes out of a place, a public bath, where people go. That's the title story, if you will, of this collection, Scenes from the Bathhouse and Other Stories of Communist Russia. When we pick it up next week, we'll pick up our first story involving this very interesting, odd, and in some ways revealing Russian writer, Mikhail Zoshchenko.